Let's talk about something every leader says they value. Let's talk about accountability versus micromanagement. What leaders get wrong. Accountability. Here is the tension. What one leader calls accountability, another person may experience as micromanagement. And that gap is where trust is either built or it is broken. Today, we are going to spend some time breaking this down. Not to say that one approach is right and the other is wrong, but to truly understand when each shows up and how each needs to be used, and how your leadership choices shape your team's performance. So let's define these terms. Let's start with clarity. Accountability is about ownership. Micromanagement is about control. Accountability says, I trust you to deliver, and I will support you along the way. Now, micromanagement says, I need to see every step to feel confident in the outcome. But here is the truth most people avoid. Both exist in leadership. So everybody does this, right? Both show up for one reason or another. The issue is not which one exists. The issue is how and why you use them. When accountability gets misused. Let's address this directly. Accountability gets misused all the time. Not as a tool for growth, but a tool for control. Yes. And that is where leaders lose credibility. Accountability is not about control, and it has never been. It is about goal attainment, it is about clarity, and quite frankly, it's about success. It should answer one question. Are we moving towards the outcome we agreed on? Not, am I watching you closely enough? What real accountability looks like. Real accountability starts with boundaries. Yes, you heard me clearly. Clear expectations, clear outcomes, clear behaviors, and clear alignment with skills. Accountability is not a one size fits all. Accountability is dependent on how we message what we want as leaders. So if you are not clear with your expectations, if you don't even know what your outcomes are going to be or what behaviors you want your team to exhibit while they're working on this project, then you're probably not going to have a good alignment. But most importantly is when you're working with people, there also has to be an alignment with the skill set of your people. And if we don't do that well, people are bound to fail. And ultimately, as the leader, that is your responsibility to ensure that you are putting out super clear expectations, that people understand their outcomes. What is it that we want to achieve? What behaviors are expected? And have I aligned the skill set to each individual in my team so that they can have a certain level of success? Now, you cannot hold someone accountable for something they were never set up to achieve, right? And so, again, it goes right back to you. How are you managing your team, and do you know them enough to set them up for success based on their skill level? And you cannot separate accountability from the capacity of the person doing the work. Now, it has to be tied to their skill set, their capacity, and the barriers in front of them. We need to know who our people are. If there are barriers that exist and leadership ignores them, accountability becomes unfair. And unfair accountability breaks trust. So let's talk about accountability as a truth-telling tool. Now, accountability is also about timing. It is telling the truth early, not waiting until something falls apart, not saving feedback or saying feedback at the end of something, but addressing gaps in real time so people can adjust, people can improve, and people can feel that they can succeed. If accountability only shows up at the end, that is not leadership. It is judgment. So sit with that. Now let's go to my next thought process here, which is when leaders protect themselves. Here is where it gets real. Let's be honest. Some leaders use accountability to protect themselves. They enforce rules that were never defined. They shift expectations after the fact. They apply standards inconsistently and then call it, you guessed it, accountability. Now, that is not accountability, my friends. That is self-preservation. We've all been there. Everybody needs to self-preserve, but a true leader is humble enough to know when they need to check themselves and be self-aware. If there are mistakes being made and they do not belong to the team but belong to you, do not use accountability for self-preservation. Be honest, get ahead of it, and get in front of it so that you can, of course, correct quickly for yourself and for your team. So, using accountability as self-preservation, know that your team will know it and they will feel it. So be mindful of how you are using accountability. Understanding micromanagement. And so let's make the distinction between the two. Now let's talk about micromanagement in an honest way. Most leaders do not choose it intentionally. And I want to believe that. They fall into this pattern of behavior. Micromanagement is often driven by pressure, deadlines, visibility, and risk. So there are reasons for micromanagement to exist. And in those moments, leaders tighten control. Understandable. So the real question is, who are you under pressure? Do you default to control? Or do you lead with clarity? All questions that, as a person leading and caring for other people, should be asking. So do not fall into a pattern of micromanagement when things get hard, because then you yourself are not growing, you're not building, you're not stretching yourself, right? Remind yourself what the cost of micromanagement are. So if you are under pressure, know yourself that if you feel like you need control because you're feeling the pressure, make a note to self. Remind yourself to lead with clarity. Which brings me to my next thought process. Let's talk about the role of self-awareness. Now, preventing micromanagement starts with you knowing who you are and being self-aware. Now, have you asked yourself these following questions? Do I trust my team? Or do I trust my presence? Because those questions are not the same. Some leaders believe work only gets done well if they are involved in everything. That creates dependency, not growth. Now think about this. When micromanagement makes sense, there are moments in which it may make sense. Now, let's be honest, micromanagement has a place. It's not all the time, but if someone is new to your team, maybe you want to micromanage. If the work is super high risk, maybe you want to micromanage. If performance has been inconsistent, maybe you want to micromanage people. There are moments in which micromanagement may need to be used intentionally. Sometimes closer guidance is appropriate in certain circumstances, but it should be temporary. Shouldn't be the standard. It should be the exception. And it should come from a space of support, never control. That is a really clear and very important distinction. Now let's talk about accountability across performance levels, because not everybody performs at the same level. You have different people from different walks and different skill sets in your team. And as a leader, you should be looking at people where they are in an equitable way. Now, accountability, it's not the same for everyone. For high performance, it is about alignment and ownership. You define the outcome, you set the expectation, and you give the space for people to flourish. For underperformance, accountability becomes more direct. You tell the truth sooner. You identify where is the gap, right? And then you build a bridge so that you can begin to build it. Whether it is a skills gap, could be a knowledge gap, or maybe it's an efforts gap. Maybe they're not into it. Who knows, right? But it's our job to build that bridge. And then you coach to the skill You coach to that knowledge and you coach to that effort. Let's talk about the two-way responsibility. Accountability is not a one-side effort. You also have to assess willingness. Is the person willing to meet the standard? Oftentimes, leaders assume that people are going to do what they are told. People are sometimes unpredictable. And so you have to be aware that you need to get willingness from your team to meet the standards. So think about how you do that, who you are and who you need to be. Because if skill can be developed, but willingness is not there, your conversation is going to change. At that point, it is about fit, right? So is this person the right fit in my team? And then you have to have the hard conversations, right? Because if people are not fitting and if there's no willingness, guess what? You're not going to meet goals. You're not going to get achievement in the way that you need it. And so it's important to address those issues of willingness early on in the process. Now, let's talk about the foundation of expectations, which is something that I find to be very important in every area of our lives. The expectations are something that need to be talked about. Let's talk about what drives all of this. Most leadership challenges are not performance issues. They are expectation gaps. Yes, you heard that correctly. Unspoken expectations, unrealistic expectations, assumed understanding. So dangerous. All three. If you do not define it, you cannot hold people accountable to it. Clarity is leadership. So let's remind ourselves that we need to be able to speak our expectations, to make them realistic, and to remove any potential assumptions because there's not enough clarity for people to follow. That is the leadership role in expectations, clarity. Now, expectations are not a one size fits all. There are two levels of expectations. There's baseline expectations, what everyone must meet, right? So everybody's at this level and everybody needs to meet me here. And then there are individual expectations. And people come with different skill sets. I think, and we talked about that earlier in the video. So you need to be able to, based on skill and capacity and experience, designate expectations. If you assign the same expectation to everyone without understanding who they are, you set people up to fail. As simple as that. Again, it always goes back to that relational piece. Know who your people are, understand what their gaps are, understand where they are in that learning continuum. If there's a skill gap, are we working to reduce that skill gap? And then are we giving them expectations that are going to challenge them, but they also are able to meet them and grow at the same time? How expectations fail leaders. Let's talk about that. Leaders fail when expectations are disconnected from reality. Yes, they are. You may communicate them clearly. You can communicate an expectation beautifully. But if they're not connected to reality, doesn't matter how clear they are. Now, if the person does not have the skill or the capacity to meet them, failures is super predictable. We all know it's not going to happen. That is not an accountability issue. That is a leadership gap, right? And so when we talk about accountability and when we talk about micromanagement, when we talk about expectations, we're talking about what is the skill set that leaders bring to the table to close gaps in all the different areas. Now, there are other things that are important as we continue to talk about expectations. So let's talk about the cost of assumptions in expectations. When assumptions are assumed instead of defined, mistakes will happen and they will increase. You have to do all of the rework, and maybe you have to do this multiple times. Frustration within your team is going to increase, and don't doubt for a second that there won't be a financial cost. because there will be a financial cost. You will miss deadlines. You will have low productivity, and you're going to have some turnover because people are not going to feel successful. But culturally, the cost is way deeper. Trust breaks down because people feel judged against rules they never agreed to. And so this becomes crucial to your success. If you want stronger accountability in your teams, maybe we start here. Not with control, not with pressure, but with honesty and clarity, with clear expectations, aligned goals, honest feedback, and leadership that adjust based on the person. Because when expectations are clear, accountability becomes fair. And when accountability is fair, performance becomes consistent. At Leader Insights, we help leaders build clarity, strengthen accountability, and create cultures where people can perform at their highest level. If this resonates with you, don't forget to follow, connect with us, and explore our Trailblazer Leadership Lab. Because leadership is not about control, it is all about alignment, trust, and intentional growth. Thanks for joining, and I will see you on the next one.